So welcome everybody to another edition of DCD Discover Dialogues. We are very pleased to be here with Allen Kaeja today. We are here, of course, during Holocaust Education Week. So speaking of things that we acknowledge and remember, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge where we are in the Dance Collection Danse office in downtown Toronto, that this land that we are working on is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, Métis, Chippewas, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It has been a site of human activity for at least tens of thousands of years. And of course, that activity includes dancing. And so here at DCD, we are very grateful to all of the caretakers, both recorded and unrecorded, of this land and of Turtle Island. Today, the meeting place of Tkaronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are very grateful to have the opportunity to work and live and dance on this land. So I'm welcoming Allen Kaeja, who many of you know is the co-founder and co-artistic director of Kaeja to Dance. He is also an acclaimed award-winning filmmaker and has produced a number of films connected to dance, and is also a very highly respected and well-liked instructor of dance, both dancing and dance filmmaking at Toronto Met University, because I also teach there and my students rave about classes with Allen. So so we know he's very well liked there. And so we're delighted to have you here today, Allen. Thank you very much. So
Yes.
since it, so I'm gonna just now, we of course are discussing the Holocaust and remembering that horrible event in history at a time when there's also a lot of turmoil in the world right now. And Allen and I have talked about this a great deal lately as we prepared for this session. And I'm just going to turn it over to you, Allen, to say a few words about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy, and thanks for this beautiful opportunity to speak about the Holocaust, but also to address the horrific events. And I just wanted to say that as a second G, or a second generation Holocaust survivor, and I am a descendant of mass genocides, I want to say I abhor all violence. I also condemn the October 7th mass murder and hostage taking by the terrorist group Hamas. And also all situations where innocent women, men, and children from all sides are targeted during conflict. The situation is terribly complex, and that goes back generations. And I truly pray every day for peace. And I believe strongly that there will be peace one day. But this will take all parties, governments, individuals to want to resolve these complex issues. My heart goes out to the innocent people, both of Gaza and Israel, who just want to live their lives. Karen and I support the rights of people everywhere to live in safety and peace.
Thank you, Allen. And yes, I concur. I think we are all hoping that a resolution will be found very soon, because there are so many innocents being affected by what is happening. So to shift to Holocaust Education Week, maybe you could start by telling us a bit about, why this week is important to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I feel it's essential to teach the Holocaust, and I actually welcome that the Ontario government is now expanding their Holocaust education. The history of anti-Semitism is not just recent, but it's over centuries and millennia. And the influence of false narratives that allowed this systematic murder of Jews, innocent men, women, and children, in incomprehensible ways is critical for us to understand where it came from, and this is, we've been to many Holocaust museums in Washington and Yad Vashem, where they always begin with where do we feel this came from? And that the intentional creation of ghettos and subsequent systems of transporting innocents to concentration camps, gas chambers, and to the murder of millions, which included not just Jews, but many different communities, LGBTQ, gypsies, communists, right?
Yeah.
How hatred, misunderstandings, and discrimination still affects us today. For myself growing up, of course, I lived it. There were many survivors. I grew up in Kitchener, Ontario, who moved to Kitchener. And my father who was a refugee and survivor, moved to Kitchener because family he was sponsored there, and there was a large community sponsoring Jews to come. And he would often have gatherings in our home. My siblings and I were very aware that my father was a Holocaust survivor. We grew up with it, and especially that he had very few precious photos that had previously been sent to his family before the war, hanging in our living room table. So here was this ghost family that was with us every day, all the time. And some of those photos are behind me, actually. Our father rarely spoke of his experiences, but over time, we heard the stories. And we learned about many aspects of the Holocaust in Hebrew school, but I didn't formally learn until I was in high school history class. And that information was limited to one class, less than an hour, and then on to the next subject.
Wow. Wow. Do you want to take a moment and point out the family photos that are behind you?
I would love to. So I have them if I share screen.
Oh, yes. Okay. That will
Let
make
me
it
just,
more visible.
I can, yeah, and then I can explain who's in the photo. All right, can you see this?
Yes.
So this is the only photo that we have of my father's family. And my father, you can see my cursor, is sitting here. They're like teenagers, and this is Bercia, which is his first wife.
Right.
And so they married quite young. We believe, we don't know full details, but we think Bercia was around 18 when they got married. These are my father's parents, and then his siblings, but we don't know which one is a sibling and a spouse of the sibling. We have inferences from old photos, but this is, and you can see there's a big crink in it because someone had folded it to bring it over to my dad.
Right.
Yeah. So that's one of these just precious family photos. And then the one right behind me is a photo just of my father's parents.
Right. And that survived because it was sent over to Canada before. Yeah. Right.
Exactly.
Amazing. I mean, who would have known at the time, right? That the road to preservation was by, putting something in an envelope and mailing it overseas, that was the way that it was going to, that those, images and memories were going to live on.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, yeah. So, of course, the DCD Discover Dialogues, we often talk about writings and research on dance. And so Allen wrote an article called Moving Memories, Kaeja Explores the Holocaust Through Dance and Film, for a free textbook published at Penn State University called The Holocaust. My thing is cut off here. It's remembrance, respect, and resilience.
Yeah.
Which I put the links in the chat if people want to go and check those out. So tell us a bit about how that writing came to be, and a little bit about your own writing process.
Yeah, thanks again for that. So Karen and I were invited down to this big conference that was taking place in Arizona called Jews and Jewishness in Dance. And this was in, I believe it was 2019. The conference was taking place, and I was invited to be a guest speaker, but also to do, Karen and I did a workshop there. And also they asked me permission to screen one of my films, Zummel, as part of their opening ceremony in the opening gathering. And so during my talk, because I had a whole slideshow, there was a number of people there. Suki John, who's a choreographer and filmmaker in her own right, and professor, her brother, Michael Polgar, and were in attendance, and they invited me to write a chapter. They got in touch with me and said, "Hey, Allen, we're doing this anthology of the Holocaust. Would you be interested in writing this article, an article on your work and how it all came about?" And I said, sure. And I had no idea it would take over 2 years and the pandemic before it was finally published. And they have authors from all over the world examining many different issues. And one of the things that was also important for them, which was why I was invited in, was moving also into the contemporary world, and how are these generations and future generations talking about accessing, dealing with the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm. Right. So maybe you can summarize a bit, like, so if for those who haven't read the article yet, of course, Allen is focusing on this series of choreographic works he made about the Holocaust and sort of inspired by your father's life. So maybe you could tell everyone a little bit about that series of works and that process.
Yeah, and I was saying to Amy earlier, we were in dialogue, and that I actually created my first piece 30 years ago. And I never intended to ever touch upon this subject, in all honesty. You know, as a young dancer, choreographer, I was working with mythology and some personal experiences and things like that. And in 1990, I started creating a piece that was really important to me, because part of my background was also working with Children's Aid Society, crisis intervention, things like that. And I created a piece called Lost Innocence that was based on child abuse. And that was a huge turning point in my life. And one of the dancers that I had invited into the process, Blake Martin, we made this very deep connection. And I had said to Blake, that I would love to just go into the studio and just play, explore. And I had no intention of what I was going to create. But what was happening is that at that time, so I had co-founded FIDA, the Fringe Festival of Independent Dance Artists. I happened to get a slot in it. And I just thought, Blake, why don't we do a performance? We'll just do a duet where we are just like tumbling and being physical and whatnot. And at that time, Karen was pregnant with our oldest, Anaya. And I just remember going through this time of absolute elation and celebration, and starting to suddenly live in this period of fear and terror that I was going to lose my family. And during this time period, Karen's pregnant, Blake and I are working on this really intense physical work. And it wasn't until the summer, because FIDA happened in August, that I was starting to complete the work. It started to shape itself. And I suddenly understood what the piece was about and what this terror of loss and fear was about. And it was the first time in my life that I implicitly understood what they mean when they talk about genealogical trauma.
Yeah.
And that in the piece ended up being called In Blood, and I can show a small trailer of it. I have a 1-minute trailer. And it was about, so my father, it's a longer story, which I have written there, but my father ended up, after being in the POW, being a resistance fighter, being in the ghetto for 2 years, knowing that his family was being systematically murdered, and then being shipped to Auschwitz. We don't know how he ended up being shipped to Auschwitz, but he ended up there. And his wife's brother, his brother-in-law, died in his arms in Auschwitz. And this is what In Blood ended up being about, was this trauma and loss. And so that was the very first piece. So I'll show you that, and then I'll go into what happened next.
Okay.
Okay, let me just. And let me know if you have any problems hearing it or anything like that, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so the ending of the piece is me holding and supporting Blake in this time. So it starts your brothers, your family, you know, how do you interact? How do you play? How do you, you know, and then it comes into this play. So it didn't intentionally be in Auschwitz itself, but the relationship of these individuals and the care and the depth of knowing. So after Blake and I finished that piece, Karen gave birth to Anaya and came up to me and said, you know, Allen, you know, the piece was really moving. And Karen really said, I would like to examine what your father's first wife must have gone through being in the ghetto with their child and then losing the family. And that's where our next film, which started as a stage work called Sarah, came from. And I was explaining to Amy earlier that at the time we were creating Sarah, this 1994, I hadn't begun my really intense research into my family history. So we didn't know my father's first wife's name, but we knew his sister's name, which was Sarah, who also perished. So for those of you who are unaware, my father lost 99% of his family, was murdered. Those who stayed in Poland were murdered. And about 80% of his community, he grew up in Kutno, lost their lives. And so any family that my father had already left Poland before the war. And that's how he ended up getting sponsorship to Canada. So Karen and I created Sarah, and you know, the questions that we had for ourselves, and Karen is here. Karen can also answer that question if you want to, honey. Was what was her experience? What was the intensity of this unknowing? Because they're in the ghetto at this point, right? They're given 24 hours. You're moved into the ghetto. They're living in abhorrent conditions. What must her experience have been, not only as a wife and a daughter and a sister, but as a mother to a newborn in this time of crisis? And then the other question we also had is, what if she survived? You know, because we don't have the written record.
Yeah.
And this is where Sarah, the stage piece came. And then 6 years later, we created the film. And Anaya was also part of that film. And that became really critical and essential. So my question to Karen, do you want to say something? If you don't mind, I'll show you again a 1-minute trailer of Sarah, if that's okay.
Yes. That'd be great.
Karen, did you want to say something?
I think the only thing I would add is that the character that was developed was very, somehow, I felt like I was reliving a life that was connected to me through genealogy. And it was very much a creation about a woman whose premonition and memory were fluid. Was it a premonition of what was to come? Was it a memory of what had gone by? And that always stayed in the pores of me while we were developing it.
Yeah. So I'll go to the trailer. All these films, by the way, for anybody who's interested, is on our website under films, and they're in there chronologically. Ooh, that was in blood. Sorry. One sec. Here we go. Can you see the screen,
Yeah.
Amy?
Yes.
Okay.
And it says it's Sarah.
Great.
The file name.
Great. Okay. Hopefully the sound is still on. Okay. Let me know if you only hear beeps. Sorry. Still playing.
Okay.
Yeah, so what was also very interesting about that time period, so Sarah ended up being in the next FIDA Fringe Festival. And at that point, I had some presenters come up to me, major presenters, because by then presenters were coming in from around the world to the festival. And they were saying to me, "What are you doing? No, nobody wants to see this work. You know, why are you creating this?" And to me, it was incredulous. It's not about whether I want to make it. It's that I have no choice. I have to create this. Once I started, the floodgates open, and that was it, you know, and it's been 30 years. And I just knew and understood that this work was critical and essential. And what was important about it, mostly for myself, was that it delved into the personal lives of the individuals affected by it. And so here are these national and international presenters going, "What the heck are you think you're doing?" But I approached Mimi Beck, who was also there the other night, of Dance Works, and I said, and Mimi had also seen the works, those first two works, and I said, I have a much larger group piece that I would like to do. And you have to understand, I never applied for funding. All these works were just created and, you know, came out of our pockets, you know, and things like that. And Mimi was the first person who took the risk and said, "Allen, I will present," and the piece became Old Country, on the DanceWorks program. And Mimi, honestly, changed my life and career. You know, by this point, I'm 35 years old, and I had been doing lots of work, but this was critical. And then Kathy Levy from Canada Dance Festival invited it to Canada Dance Festival. And that's when An Old Country was about how these communities that were together for generations, they would go to each other's houses for lunch. Like I would talk to survivors like Ted Milo, and he would say, I'd go to my neighbors for what we would now have as craft dinner. You know, we'd have lunch together. We'd go to school. The adults had businesses together. Like we were a community. And overnight, they turned their backs on us. Right. You know, of course, there's always righteous, what they call righteous Christians, righteous people.
Right. So these were non-Jewish friends from school.
That's right.
Of course.
Exactly. That's what I mean. Like they were a community. They breathed together. They grew together. They played, fought, you know.
Yeah.
But they were a community. And so Old Country, I wanted to focus on the day before the war and the day after the war and the betrayal that happened. And this was in 1995. And so I actually hadn't started working in dance film at that point. And it was actually Karen, after I completed the work, and then the work got a national tour from Halifax to Vancouver, which included In Blood, Sarah, and then one of Karen's duets, Eugene Walks with Grace. And it was powerful. And I had these very influential filmmakers at the time come up to me and say, Allen, we'd love to turn Old Country into film. It's so visually compelling and important. And this was the first time that all levels of, it was the old Ice House, right, Du Maurier Theater, were used in a dance production.
Okay.
Because the Ice House wasn't that old at that point. And I harnessed all the levels of it so that even when we went on tour, we went to balconies of theaters to present it. And it changed everything. It changed my world. And I also have a trailer of the film. Would you like to?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is, because I mean, they're all very powerful, but I love the physicality, in particular in Old Country.
Yeah, thank you. And let me just see where it is. Here it is. Oh, sorry, I'm going to stop this share and find just, I think, let me know if you see it, because I'm just, here we go. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So it's just a couple of minutes. Move this over. And that was the first film that was nominated for Gemini and received awards and things like that. It was really, really intense, because what ended up happening is that those filmmakers who wanted to turn Old Country into a film, both of them ended up not happening by them. And I remember saying to myself, that means that one day I'm going to shoot it.
Okay.
You know, I just knew it, even though I hadn't started delving into dance film. And the one thing that I want to also acknowledge is that my friend Mark Adam had approached me. And so we created 8 of these films together.
Right.
And Mark is brilliant. And it was just an absolute revelation to work with Mark. I just have to say that Lila came on my lap. So after Old Country, sorry, did you have a question? I'm just going into
No, you keep going. You keep going.
History and trailers. What happened there is that Gene Yasko, who had also been in a number of FIDAs, a number of the festivals, approached me. Gene had just been made artistic director of Nordans in Sweden, and said, Allen, I would love to commission you to create a work on my company. And I said to Gene, I said, you know, Gene, I would love to, but you have to understand that I'm investing in this Holocaust work and I'm not done. My next piece, which ended up being called Zummel, is what I want to create. And Gene's first words to me were, Allen, Sweden is not innocent. They were complicit in many different ways, and they need your work. And so the piece that I created on her company, which toured Europe, I ended up calling Zummel, or Yiddish for gathering. And that it was based upon this crisis of uncertainty when you're given 24 hours to leave your home. You're being relocated, which in most cases were the ghettos, and that you were being forced to grab whatever you could. And there you go. And most of them perished. So I created the stage work, and then in 1999, shot the film Zummel. And if you don't mind, I'll show you the trailer of Zummel. It's so, I mean, we're dance, right? We're so...
Yeah, no, it's great to, well, and this is the thing, the whole writing is about the dance and the films, right? So it's nice to be able to see these short clips.
Okay, let me just find, where is Zummel? Here we go. Can you see that okay?
Yep. I love the water in that film, because It really does capture that vulnerability that you were talking about, right? Because while water nourishes us and we need it for survival, we can't breathe under it. We can't, right? And there's that vulnerability when you're floating on it, you don't have balance. If you land in it, you could perish. It's really quite a beautiful metaphor.
And what was really most devastating to me, so this film was made 20 years ago, right? We're doing the conference in Arizona, and immediately people are coming up and saying, look at the thousands of refugees attempting to cross the Mediterranean at that time period. Like the symbolism of the raft and the precariousness of life, and how many, like, you notice people are disappearing off that raft one at a time as the film progresses until there's one person left that actually makes it to safety, right? Made it to Canada, and which is symbolic of my father's journey. But it unfortunately, and this is the power of art, right? We create from our intuition, from our universality of connection. And sometimes it has more relevance to the world today than we can ever imagine.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. I always get really emotional.
Yeah.
Watching the films.
Sure, of course.
Yeah, because I know where they came from, and I just, I care deeply about my history, my ancestry, my family, our community. Karen, I've done so much for the community. The community is so essential. And how do we speak, right? We're dance artists, speak with our bodies, with our beings. And so can I continue for a second?
Yes.
Unless you have a question you want to ask.
No.
So after Zummel, I came back and I approached Mimi again and said, Mimi, I have a devastating work that I need to create. Will you support it? So and that became, so it was called Courtyard, and it was about the ghetto. And I remember during the creation of that, it was the first time that I really started delving into interviewing people who were survivors, but also this is 1997, survivors were also starting to pass. And Mark then approached me. This is the first time Mark approached me. I was in the middle of building Courtyard, which takes place in the ghetto. Right. And Mark says, hey, Allen, I'd love to make a film with you. I hear you're working on something new. And I said, yeah, it's about the ghetto. It's not a pretty piece. And Mark said, well, I'm Jewish. And I didn't know Mark was Jewish. And he said, it's critical that we make this now. We applied to Bravo Fact and we got it. It was our first Bravo Fact short dance film together. And I said to Mark, I'll create this with you if we can co-direct it. And Mark was totally into it. And so we took this 50-minute work and crushed it into 5 minutes. And it was the first piece that was shortlisted for the jury prize in IMZ Europe. It was, and then it also went on a world circuit. What's interesting about Zummel actually ended up receiving the jury prize 2 years later. So Courtyard, which becomes Witnessed, was the first film that was shortlisted. Zummel wins. It was on their best of world tour for 10 years. Wow. Right. And it's played at the Museum of Civilization in Quebec City. It was part of one of their exhibits. It's just played around the world since its inception. But Witness was the first one. And I'll tell you a little story before I show it is when I approached, we were in partnership with Bravo for a bit. And the curator at Bravo said to me, do you realize that Witnessed is the most aired film in the history of Bravo Network?
Wow.
And he said, when we watched it, we'd never seen anything like it. And we just played it wherever, whenever we could. We just put it on, the whole programming team. So anyway, it's not a fun film, but this is witnessed. It's just the trailer of it, but. Sorry. Sorry, I'm going to pause here. I realize I don't have the trailers as actually the full film.
Okay.
And that the trailer that I had was very old and actually was artifacted. But so, and that shot in the distillery before the distillery became the distillery.
I wondered if that was the case. Yeah, I thought I recognized it.
Yeah, yeah, and phenomenal cast of people, and it was really intense because we would go into the studio, we would tape out the floor, rehearse those sections, because all we had was one day in the distillery. That was it to shoot.
Wow.
You know, went in 16 mil, old RE, and back then they were charging $2,000 a day. This is 1997. And so we found out that the owners were Jewish. So we said, can you give us a break? And they said, it's about the Holocaust. And they said, sure, give us $1,000. So anyway, so after Courtyard, so the stage piece was so dark, it was so heavy, but the film played everywhere in the world, on Australian TV, German TV, like everything. After that, I got another commission from Nordance, and then started winning some awards, going to Europe, started doing works all over the world. And at that point, I talked to Kathy Levy, who was the programmer at Harborfront. And I told her my next concept, which was Resistance. I said, I need to end this trilogy with hope. And so we opened the year 2000 in Harborfront with Resistance. And Resistance is about, you know, the human spirit, and, you know, how do we forge a pathway against oppression and authoritarianism and fascism and things like that. And so we opened Harborfront season. Resistance, the stage work, actually toured North America for 7 years. Wow. And reached thousands and thousands of people from Mexico through the States, all the way up to the Yukon, across Canada. And then the film, of course, went all over the world. That was the beauty of film. And that was Karen's vision. Karen knew it. And So I'll show you an excerpt of Resistance, if that's okay. And then
Yeah,
I know
great.
we're coming to conclusion here. Let me just find. Okay. And this I put in all my programs. The film is dedicated to those who remember and those we cannot forget.
Yeah.
Knowing that eventually.
Amazing.
Yeah. So, and that was a 21-minute film, and that was the first film sponsored. So that was after the 3 films witnessed Sarah Zummel. Bravo came in and sponsored Resistance, and then CBC came in and sponsored Old Country.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah, sorry. There's a whole whack of histories going. Right?
Yeah.
And then my film based on fascism, which is Asylum of Spoons, was again sponsored by Bravo.
Right. Okay. And that it's such an amazing series, but it's also it's also wonderful to see your expansion as an artist, right? Delving into another medium. And like, we don't have a ton of time left, but maybe you could just touch on that process for you and, your learnings as a filmmaker.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. And again, we only have a few minutes, right? So.
Yeah. I know, we were joking in advance. Alan and I could talk for hours. And sometimes too.
Well, it also lends to your curiosity and your fascination too, Amy. So, but for myself, I count myself as blessed that I created these as stage works first. So in a sense, they were the screenplay. And what I needed to create was the shot list. And by creating and turning these into film, what I was able to do, it wasn't about documenting a stage work, but actually physicalizing and realizing and putting into location the events that I was trying to express. And what was really beautiful about that and working with Mark is that Mark would not only get into in-depth conversations about what is the work about, but where do I see it? What is the coloration of the work? Like, we intentionally shot Witnessed in black and white. You know, how do we want to capture this? What is the story? What's the essentiality? And so being able to take these works, thank goodness they were stage works, because I knew them, I understood them intimately. And then we're developing the shot list, knowing that all these films, all the Sarah Zumwalt were shot in one day. That's all we had, right? Whereas Resistance, we actually had 3.5 days, like, which was a miracle at that point. And so we needed to know exactly. So we would go into I would take the choreography, except for Sarah. Karen co-directed, co-created Sarah with me and Mark. But we would go into the studio, mark it out, bring in these horrific VHS cameras, but they were the frame, and we would pace out, we would detail all of our shots so that once we were on location with real cameras and real film and in some cases crews up to 30 people, then we needed to know what we were doing. Because
yeah, right. It's almost like a dress rehearsal for the shoot. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And that was, so the transition for me was initially, you know, quite challenging, but so inspiring and so essential, so that by the time I shot Asylum of Spoons, I was creating the stage work and writing the shot list and screenplay at the same time, so that they were all interchanged, and the marriage was succinct.
Right. Amazing. Well, we've hit 2:00, so we do need to wrap up. I know I've got like 10 other questions here, but I want to end by saying that DCD is very proud to be the archivists for Kaeja to Dance and for Karen and Allen's work. It is a substantial collection, one of the largest collections in the archives. We have costumes and all kinds of documentation, artistic records, photographs, moving images. And I just take like 1 minute and just explain that the impact, you and I have talked about this many times, the impact of your father's experience coming here with practically nothing, and how that has influenced you as an archivist.
Yeah, thank you. And there's one other thing that I want to mention is that Edgardo Moreno has been our composer for over 30 years and is brilliant and has done all the stage and film work. So I want to thank Edgardo as well for his vision. But my father came over penniless, without a cent, and I have letters from my father to my uncle, who I'm named after, saying that I don't have anything, but I have basically my body, my will, my spirit, and I will take care of myself. All I need to do is get there. And that he basically guaranteed that he would not have to be supported. And so he came over with nothing. My mother was born in Kensington Market. They grew up in poverty and through the Depression. So they also had nothing. And my mother's father passed away quite early. And so for them, my father kept everything, his train ticket, his boat ticket, like his train ticket when he landed in Halifax, his boat ticket, like all these were so precious. And then whatever photos he was able to get, like that was so precious. So we actually have this incredible photo album that people gave him photos of his sister and their first wife, So, and it's all contained in a tiny album, and that's everything. But my father also kept all his letters that he had received. And then some people gave him back letters that he sent to them,
Okay.
which was also a gift. So we have all that, and I'm still in the process of documenting some of that. But in terms of Karen and mine's archiving, we learned in an early age that it is precious. It is our ancestry at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, you have done a fantastic job of saving everything. I can attest to that firsthand. But it's wonderful because the record is there, and it's not even so much now that we think of it's 50 years from now, right? It's there for people to see and to learn from. And yeah, so anyhow,
And we
thank
thank
you.
you and Miriam and Lawrence, and just your dedication is critical and essential to our dance ecology in Canada. I also want to thank you for that.
Oh, well, thanks, Alan. Thank you. Well, it's a labor of love for sure. So thank you so much for being here today and for sharing that, those very moving film clips and this whole very, very personal story with us. We really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone for joining us here today for this edition of DCD Discovered Dialogues.